Title: The Hand of Truth. At Deering Hill, the scene of the tragic events surrounding Vivian Barnaby's murder, there were complexities that not even the sharpest minds could fully grasp. Mr. Satterthwaite, a man of keen intellect, had been wrestling with the case for days, knowing there was more to the story than the evidence let on. As he sat across from the enigmatic Mr. Quinn, he began to weave a narrative that unraveled the tightly knotted lives of the Barnabys, revealing that beneath the surface of the case, a web of lies, passions, and dark secrets had been brewing for years. The events leading up to the murder were more than mere happenstance. They were the product of a deep and unsettling tension that had built up over time. Mr. Satterthwaite could not shake the feeling that the answers were buried in the lives of these people, hiding in plain sight. Sir George Barnaby, the elderly, wealthy patriarch, was a man obsessed with control. His life was marked by peculiar routines, winding his clocks every Friday, meticulously paying the housekeeper every Tuesday, and checking the locks every night. He appeared to be the model of stability and prudence, but Mr. Satterthwaite knew better. Beneath the surface of this self-made man was a deep-seated need to possess everything around him, especially his young wife, Vivian. His obsession with the trivialities of life was an attempt to exert control over a world that felt increasingly out of his grasp. The more Mr. Satterthwaite dug into Sir George's character, the more he saw a man who, despite his outward air of invincibility, was terrified of losing his grip on the world he had carefully built. Vivian, the young and vibrant second wife of Sir George, was a woman caught in a suffocating marriage. To the outside world, she was the picture of grace and beauty, but those who looked closer saw a woman desperate to escape a life she hadn't chosen. She had married Sir George in haste, blinded by the security he offered, but now, as time wore on, she had come to realize the price of her decision. With no money of her own and no means of escape, Vivian was a prisoner in her own home, bound by invisible chains. Despite her husband's overbearing presence, she still possessed a quiet strength, a defiance that simmered beneath the surface. It was this quiet rebellion, this undying hope for freedom, that made her both tragic and mesmerizing. But the more Mr. Satterthwaite thought about her, the more he wondered, was she truly a victim, or was there something darker at play in her own heart? The circumstances of her death seemed clear-cut to the jury, an unfortunate murder by a husband, or perhaps a desperate act of revenge. But as Mr. Satterthwaite delved deeper into the puzzle, he began to question whether the answers were as simple as they appeared. The more he spoke to Mr. Quinn, the more he realized how much of the truth remained hidden behind the facade of a perfect life. What if the murder was not the culmination of a single violent act, but the result of years of built-up resentment, betrayal, and unspoken truths? Was the killer truly Martin Wilde, the young, handsome man whose passion for Vivian had been the talk of the town, or was there a more sinister hand at work, guiding the events toward their inevitable, tragic conclusion? As Mr. Satterthwaite's mind raced, he couldn't shake the feeling that the true answer lay not in the obvious facts, but in the shadows, the dark corners where secrets were kept and desires were allowed to fester unchecked. Could the truth be more elusive than anyone had imagined? Could it be that the events at Deering Hill were the result of a much deeper, more complicated web of emotions, hidden from everyone but those who were destined to see it? The details were all there, clear, almost undeniable, but there lingered a whisper of doubt. As Mr. Satterthwaite continued, his voice grew softer, more contemplative, as though he was trying to piece together a puzzle that refused to be solved. All the servants were certain of one thing, he began, adjusting his glasses, the flickering candlelight casting elongated shadows on his face. The shot rang out at exactly 20 minutes past 6. The sound echoed through the house, a sharp, final note that shattered the tense silence. The cook, the kitchen maid, the butler, the housemaid, and even Lady Barnaby's own maid, they all heard it. All of them came rushing to the music room, their footsteps clattering in the hall. And there she was, Lady Barnaby, collapsed in her chair, her once vibrant presence now lifeless. The gun had been fired so close to her head that there was no room for doubt about its intent. The damage was done, and the death was swift. At least 2 shots had struck the brain, a brutal end to a life already filled with turmoil. Mr. Satterthwaite paused, leaning forward, his eyes locking with Mr. Quinn's. The question, of course, was not how she died, but who had fired the fatal shot. The servants had arrived in a flurry, but not a one had seen anything, not a whisper of movement before the gun went off. The housemaid, however, was absent. She hadn't been there when it all happened, though. She had been called to testify at the inquest. And now, of all things, she had disappeared, gone to Canada, as I heard. Why, Mr. Quinn? Why would someone like her leave just after witnessing the tragic end of her employer? Mr. Quinn's gaze was steady, his thoughts clearly turning inwards. Why indeed? He mused, his voice soft, almost like a whisper against the hum of the restaurant. Mr. Satterthwaite shifted in his chair, his words brimming with curiosity now, a far cry from his earlier certainty. But think about it, Quinn. The servants' accounts didn't add up. They all arrived at the scene within seconds of each other, yet there wasn't a single sign of struggle, no indication of an intruder. No, the shot could only have been fired by someone inside the house. The time was too precise, too synchronized with Martin Wilde's movements. His own account of the evening was shaky at best. He had left Lady Barnaby alive, supposedly, and his gun was left behind. Yet there was no sign of him carrying it with him when he departed. No sign of bloodshed on his clothes. How could someone forget a gun like that after such a violent confrontation? True, Mr. Quinn replied, leaning back slightly, his fingers tapping thoughtfully on the edge of his wine glass. But there are cracks in this theory, are there not? Satterthwaite nodded, sensing the challenge ahead. Yes, cracks. Martin's story was weak, that much was clear. He claimed to have left the house at exactly 6:15 p.m., and by all accounts it was impossible for him to have traveled back to his farm in the time it took for the shot to ring out. Even if he had taken the longest route possible, he would have reached home far earlier than he did. His delay, his hesitation, it was as if he had forgotten something crucial. Was it the gun? Or was there another reason, something more sinister that made him linger longer than he admitted? Mr. Quinn's face remained unreadable, his eyes sharp with curiosity. And what of the others? Sir George, for example. Was he at the scene, the secretary, the maid? Did any of them have reason to be near the music room that evening? Mr. Satterthwaite was quick to respond, his mind piecing together the details. No, none of them had any opportunity. Sir George was at a bridge party a few houses away, and he had an alibi confirmed by several witnesses. He left precisely at 6:30 and was met by a servant just outside his gate. That checks out. The secretary, Henry Thompson, was in London at the time of the crime, at a business meeting, his whereabouts confirmed. And Sylvia Dale, the other woman, had a clear alibi as well, for she was seen at the Deering Vale station at 6:28 p.m. saying goodbye to a friend. Everyone accounted for except for one, Mr. Quinn noted, his voice a mere murmur as he leaned forward, his gaze fixed intently on Satterthwaite. Martin Wilde, the one person who could have been in that music room and fired the fatal shot. Satterthwaite's expression hardened, his mind racing as he connected the dots. Yes, but there's something more, Quinn. There's the matter of the telephone. It wasn't working when the servants finally thought to call the police. They were delayed, and when they finally got through, the investigation had been compromised. Was the phone line cut, or was it simply a coincidence? Mr. Quinn did not immediately answer, but instead he remained silent, allowing the question to linger in the air. The restaurant's dim light flickered, casting shadows on their faces. Satterthwaite's pulse quickened, the weight of the mystery pressing down on him. No one else had a motive, Satterthwaite continued, his voice tense with realization. It had to be Martin Wilde. There was no one else. His alibi was weak, his actions erratic, and the servants who could have been key witnesses were disoriented, lost in the chaos. All signs pointed to him. And yet, Mr. Quinn, I can't shake the feeling that there's more to this than meets the eye. Something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. Mr. Quinn's gaze shifted, his eyes narrowing in thought. Indeed, Mr. Satterthwaite, he said softly. But sometimes the simplest answer is not the whole truth. Mr. Satterthwaite paused for a moment, his brow furrowing in concentration. Louisa's tone was unsettlingly matter-of-fact, and her words hung in the air like a thick fog. He could feel the shift in the conversation, the slow unraveling of a puzzle he hadn't quite anticipated. He shifted his position in the chair, leaning slightly forward, and gave Louisa a steady look. So, you felt something was going to happen that evening? That's an extraordinary thing to say. What made you feel that way? Louisa shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting towards the window, as if the very act of recalling that night stirred something unsettling in her. Well, sir, she said slowly, almost as though speaking the words aloud for the first time. It was the way she was. Lady Barnaby, I mean. She was always off about that time of evening. I don't know what it was, but she'd get this look in her eye, like she was waiting for something, or someone. I'd seen it before, when things were going wrong in the house. Mr. Satterthwaite was silent, his mind already racing ahead, putting the pieces of this strange conversation together. The sense of dread Louisa had described, the oppressive atmosphere that had clung to Lady Barnaby's every movement that evening, was unsettling. Yet it was a detail that had been dismissed by many of the other servants, who simply went about their duties, unaffected by the undercurrent of tension. Did Lady Barnaby say anything to you, Louisa, that night? Anything that might give us a clue as to what she was planning? He asked, his voice edged with quiet intensity. Louisa hesitated, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. No, sir, she replied, shaking her head. Nothing that would make sense now. But I remember she had a letter in her hand when she came down that evening. She was looking at it a lot, almost as though she was trying to make up her mind about something. Maybe that was the letter Mr. Wilde received, the one that sent him running straight to her. But I can't say for sure. All I know is something was different about her that night. She wasn't herself, not at all. Mr. Satterthwaite felt a chill creep up his spine. Every word Louisa spoke seemed to corroborate the feeling he had been wrestling with for days, that there was more to this story than anyone was willing to admit. The tragedy at Deering Hill, the trial, the conviction of Martin Wilde. Everything had felt so neat, so wrapped up in a tidy bow. But now, the cracks were starting to appear, and the more he uncovered, the more uneasy he became. I understand, he said softly. But you also mentioned before that you knew something was going to happen that night. What made you feel that way? Louisa sighed, her eyes clouded with the weight of the past. You see, sir, it was a feeling I got sometimes, working in the house. You can't explain it, but when you live with people day in and day out, you start to sense things. She, Lady Barnaby, wasn't always an easy woman to work for. She had moods, I suppose. And that night, she wasn't just agitated, she was obsessed. I could see it in her eyes as she stared at that letter. She was fixated on something. I just didn't know what. Mr. Satterthwaite was quiet for a long moment, his thoughts swirling. "And did you ever hear her mention anything about the young woman? The other one, the one who was close to Martin Wilde?" "Miss Dale, you mean?" Louisa's eyes narrowed. "I don't know if she mentioned her outright, but there was talk about her, you know. The servants, we'd hear things. Lady Barnaby didn't like her very much, I don't think. There was some jealousy, and I heard once that she accused Miss Dale of trying to take something away from her, something precious. But that was before my time. Things were already starting to unravel by then." This was another piece of the puzzle. The jealousy Louisa mentioned, was it enough to spark a deeper motive? The mention of Martin Wilde and his relationship with the two women left a gnawing question in Mr. Satterthwaite's mind. Was Lady Barnaby simply a victim of her own desires and emotions, or was there a deeper, more sinister force at play? He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "You said before that you knew something was going to happen. Was it just the atmosphere, or did you hear anything, something that might have given you more insight into Lady Barnaby's intentions?" Louisa bit her lip, her eyes flicking towards the door, as though she feared someone might overhear. She lowered her voice almost to a whisper. "There was one more thing, sir. I didn't want to say it before because it sounded foolish, but now I think you should know. That night, I swear, I heard her talking to someone who wasn't there. I didn't see them, but I could hear her voice, low, urgent, like she was trying to convince someone of something, but no one was in the room but her. And I didn't see anyone leave either." Mr. Satterthwaite's heart skipped a beat. He had heard enough. This small, seemingly inconsequential detail, Lady Barnaby talking to someone unseen, was the key to unlocking the entire mystery. Could it be that she had been expecting someone else that evening? Someone who wasn't part of the official story? His mind whirled with possibilities. If Lady Barnaby had been conversing with an unseen presence, was she truly the orchestrator of her own demise? Or had she been manipulated by another force, perhaps an accomplice? The unanswered questions loomed large, and it seemed that each piece of the puzzle only led to more complexity. Mr. Satterthwaite stood up, his face set with determination. "Thank you, Louisa," he said, his voice steady but edged with urgency. "You've been very helpful. I believe we are getting closer to the truth." As he walked away from the hotel, the weight of his mission settled on his shoulders. Louisa's revelations were only the beginning. He was more certain than ever that Martin Wilde's conviction was a mistake. Someone else was involved in this tangled web, a shadowy figure whose influence had not yet been fully revealed. But Mr. Satterthwaite wasn't about to give up now. Not when the stakes were so high. And, as he stepped into the cold mountain air, he couldn't shake the feeling that the true killer, if that's what they were, was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. But who could it be? And what had really happened that fateful night at Deering Hill? Mr. Satterthwaite paused, momentarily lost in the details, before he resumed, his voice steady with the knowledge he'd gained. "Oh, well, it takes about an hour and a half," he continued. "The last time I was down there, I took the 10:48 from Waterloo, and it was quite a comfortable ride. The trains may not be the fastest, but they've their own charm, especially when you're trying to escape the hustle and bustle of London. Deering Vale feels just far enough to be a retreat, but not so far that it's inconvenient. The house there, you know, it's not particularly grand, but it's the kind of place that you could easily picture rich men retiring to, people who want to escape the city, but still be close enough to it to visit whenever they please. Red brick, bay windows. It's got that typical suburban charm, though I'm sure some would call it hideous from the outside. But, the inside. Comfort at its finest. It's like stepping into a hotel, honestly. Large suites, electric lights with gilded fittings, baths in each bedroom. Everything designed for ease, luxury without fuss. It's all very practical, very clean, very modern in a way that's just short of ostentatious. Quite a contrast to the older country homes with their creaky floors and heavy drapes. But I suppose that's what people want these days. The grounds, though, I think they do their best to make the place feel grand. 2 acres of land, neatly kept, perfect for a garden party or a quiet walk in the late afternoon. But still, there's something about it that seems out of place. I don't know. Maybe it's the contrast between the outside world, busy and full of life, and the stillness of Deering Vale. You get the feeling it's stuck in between, not quite part of either world, like it's trying too hard to fit in, you know? Mr. Quinn, who had been listening attentively, leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed the details. "So, what makes this place special?" he asked, his voice smooth but probing, as if he were trying to unearth something deeper. Satterthwaite paused, feeling the weight of the question. He had painted a picture of Deering Vale, yes, but now it felt like Mr. Quinn was asking for something more, something that lay beneath the surface. It's the people, isn't it?" he said slowly, his voice softening. "The Barnabys, especially. There's an air about them, about that house. Something that's hard to put into words. On the outside, it's just another house, just another rich family. But when you step inside, when you hear the stories, the things people talk about in hushed tones, that's when it feels like there's something more. Like there's a secret hidden just behind those grand curtains and those gilded lights. I don't know if it's the place or the people, but something doesn't sit right with me about it all." He leaned forward, his tone shifting to one of quiet intensity. "The whole thing, it's just too perfect, too staged." Mr. Quinn smiled faintly, as if he had been expecting this. "It's never the house, Mr. Satterthwaite," he said, his voice carrying a touch of mystery. "It's always the people. And the people, my dear friend, are what make the house interesting." As the taxi rolled to a stop in front of the Arlecchino, a peculiar sense of anticipation hung in the air. Mr. Satterthwaite, deep in thought, was momentarily distracted from his companion. Sylvia Dale sat beside him, her eyes vacant, as if the weight of the day had already started to take its toll. The brief moment of quiet, however, didn't last long as the two of them stepped into the warm glow of the restaurant, a haven of solace in an otherwise tumultuous day. He ushered Sylvia inside with a kind smile, though his mind lingered on the shocking turn of events. Her words had shaken him. Sylvia had confronted Sir George Barnaby with an audacity that bordered on brilliance. She'd told him everything, including Louisa Bullard's confession, the incriminating time frames, and the damning evidence that had been quietly building behind Sir George's back. And somehow, through all of it, Sylvia had held the upper hand, forcing Sir George to sign his own confession with the simplicity of a desperate man. The gravity of her actions settled heavily on his chest as they walked into the quiet, dimly lit dining area. The place had a quiet charm, with its soft light casting shadows on the walls and the low hum of conversations from the other tables, but it was clear that the table in the far corner, the one that Mr. Satterthwaite had been hoping to see occupied, was empty. His heart sank, and for a moment the room seemed to grow a little colder. He had half expected Mr. Harley Quinn to be sitting there, his usual enigmatic smile waiting to greet him, but there was no sign of the mysterious man. Sylvia, noticing his shift in mood, glanced over at him with a gentle question in her eyes. "What is it?" she asked, her voice soft, almost too fragile for the weight of the moment. Mr. Satterthwaite shook his head, brushing aside his disappointment. "Nothing," he replied, forcing a smile as he led her to a nearby table. "It's just that, Well, I thought I might see a friend of mine here." She raised an eyebrow, clearly curious but not pressing. Mr. Satterthwaite couldn't help but wonder how much Sylvia truly understood about the situation. The girl had a way of surprising him, of acting with an almost reckless, yet intuitive confidence. It wasn't just the fact that she'd gotten Sir George to sign a confession without a second thought. It was the way she had manipulated the situation to her advantage, playing the part of a naive, innocent girl while steering the entire event to its conclusion. As they sat down at the table, he couldn't help but feel a sense of melancholy creeping in. There was no sign of Mr. Quinn. Perhaps he had already left, or maybe he was just never meant to be there. That was the problem with Mr. Quinn, Mr. Satterthwaite mused. He was always present in the most subtle, unexpected ways, leaving people to question whether they had truly seen him at all. He had never been a man of great physical presence, but his influence, it lingered, like a shadow, just beyond reach. Sylvia, perhaps sensing the quiet storm within him, placed her hand gently on the table and gave him a steady look. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice quiet but unwavering. He met her gaze, the weight of everything finally sinking in. "Now, we wait. The confession will be delivered and the police will take it from there." He paused, his mind flickering to the final pieces of the puzzle. "You've done a remarkable thing today, Sylvia. I don't think you realize how much you've changed the course of events." She merely shrugged, the faintest hint of a smile on her lips. "I just did what needed to be done. I couldn't let him get away with it, not after everything that happened." There was a sadness in her voice that didn't go unnoticed. Mr. Satterthwaite could see it now, the toll this case had taken on her. She had started out so full of hope, eager to make a difference, but now she seemed as weary as he felt. Still, there was something unyielding about her, a quiet strength that was undeniable. As he sat there, lost in thought, the restaurant's soft music played in the background, the gentle clink of silverware the only sound between them. For a moment, everything felt suspended in time, as if the world outside had ceased to matter. It wasn't until Sylvia shifted slightly in her chair, glancing toward the door, that he snapped back to reality. "Do you think we've really won?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Satterthwaite looked at her, his expression serious. "I think we've done everything we could. The rest is up to fate." He leaned back, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. "But perhaps some mysteries are better left unsolved." Sylvia didn't reply right away, her eyes fixed on the far corner of the room. And as he followed her gaze, he couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of unease, as though the game was far from over. Just as quickly as it had started, it seemed, the mystery would twist again, just out of reach. But for now, there was nothing left to do but wait. The main lesson from this story is the importance of having courage and determination when faced with challenges. Sylvia Dale's example teaches us that sometimes we need to trust our instincts and push forward with our thoughts instead of giving in to fear. She forced Sir George to admit his guilt with his own hands, showing that when we have a clear and strong understanding of our intentions, we can change much. Additionally, this story teaches us the vital lesson that confronting the truth is necessary, no matter how difficult it may seem. It reminds us that every problem has a solution, but it requires patience and a decisive approach to find it. As long as we stay true to our courage and the truth, nothing is too difficult to overcome.